When he met the new gardener, the millionaire was stunned to see his pendant, the same one his son wore when he disappeared years ago. Richard Clark was a man who seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and an imposing mansion in Los Angeles, surrounded by meticulously manicured gardens and a life that, to outsiders, was the epitome of success. But behind the marble and glass walls, there was a pain that never faded. 15 years earlier, Richard's heart had been shattered in a way that neither time nor money could mend. His son, Ethan, had vanished without a trace during a trip to the park with the nanny. The boy was just 8 years old at the time, and the tragedy became the deepest wound in Richard's life. Before continuing, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Back then, Richard mobilized every resource at his disposal to find him. He hired the best private investigators, offered generous rewards, and devoted his life to uncovering Ethan's whereabouts. But as the years passed, hope gave way to bitter acceptance and silent mourning. He kept Ethan's room untouched, a sanctuary frozen in time, and locked away in an oak box were the most precious mementos of his son: photos, drawings, and a pendant from a matching pair. The other, identical one, had been with Ethan when he disappeared. Richard's mornings often began with him staring at the Los Angeles skyline from his office window. But he didn't see the city. He saw the years that had passed without holding his son in his arms again. His life, though outwardly full, was devoid of what mattered most: love and purpose. The trauma of Ethan's disappearance shaped every facet of Richard Clark's existence. While he continued to lead his multimillion-dollar corporation with the same relentless drive as before, there was a part of him that would never be whole again. To his colleagues and the media, he was a visionary, an unstoppable business magnate. But those who worked closely with him saw another side: a man who avoided social gatherings, who drifted into deep thought during critical meetings, and who carried a perpetual sadness in his eyes. Every night, before going to bed, Richard performed a ritual visit to Ethan's room. That space was a piece of time frozen in place. The toys were arranged just as Ethan had left them, the children's books neatly lined up on the shelves, and the bed still held the star-patterned blanket the boy had adored. Richard would sit in the armchair beside the bed, clutching the pendant he kept as a relic. He would close his eyes and let memories of his son flood his mind. The infectious laughter, the tight hugs, and the way Ethan called him, my hero, these memories kept him alive, yet they also fed the pain that refused to fade. But it wasn't just Ethan's room that served as a sanctuary. His absence was etched into the fabric of the entire house. Photos of Ethan were scattered throughout various rooms, but none were recent, only images of an 8-year-old boy with a radiant smile. Over the years, friends and family suggested that Richard move on, perhaps remodel the house or donate his son's belongings. But he could never bring himself to do it. To Richard, erasing any trace of Ethan would be like admitting he would never come back. Slowly, this constant mourning became part of his routine. Richard had stopped making plans for the future and lived solely to manage his business, as if fulfilling this obligation was the only way to fill the void. Even moments of joy, like landing new contracts or expanding his company, were quickly overshadowed by melancholy. Richard's trauma wasn't just emotional. It was physical, manifesting in sleepless nights, lack of appetite, and a fatigue that even the luxury of his life couldn't alleviate. The arrival of Jack Dawson at the Clark mansion was marked by the simplicity of someone who didn't seek attention. He appeared at the beginning of spring, with a worn-out backpack slung over his shoulder and the calloused hands of a young man used to hard work. At 23, Jack didn't harbor grand ambitions. He simply wanted a stable job that would allow him to cover his expenses and continue living his modest life. His demeanor was calm, almost melancholic, and his polite speech conveyed a rare humility. Richard wasn't present the morning Jack was hired. It was Clara, the housekeeper, who welcomed him. Clara was an experienced woman who had worked for the Clark family for decades. and she knew the garden desperately needed care. She saw something in Jack that made her trust him instantly. Perhaps it was the way he carefully examined the state of the plants, or the respectful tone in which he spoke to her. Without hesitation, Clara hired him and instructed him to start the next morning. When Jack began working, his dedication was evident from the very first moment. He spent hours among the rose bushes and shrubs, clearing dried leaves, pruning branches, and planting new flowers. The garden, which had once seemed neglected, began to come alive again. Although Jack performed his work quietly, his presence was impossible to ignore. The rhythmic movement of his tools and the fresh scent of turned soil brought a new energy to the space, as if the garden was being reborn alongside the young worker. On the third morning of Jack's employment, Richard finally noticed him while gazing out of his office window. The millionaire was surprised to see a new face in the garden, but he didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't until later, during his usual walk through the grounds, that Richard had his first encounter with Jack. The young man, covered in dirt and sweat, looked up as he saw Richard approaching. "Good morning, Mr. Clark," Jack said, removing his hat with a respectful gesture. Richard replied with a brief nod, studying the young man with a distant gaze. Something about Jack's demeanor, though subtle, caught Richard's attention. There was a familiarity in the young man's posture, in the way he looked at the garden, as if it meant more to him than just a job. But Richard quickly dismissed the thought, chalking it up to his tired mind. At that moment, he had no idea how much this young man would change his life forever. The day of the encounter that would change everything began like any other. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the newly tended gardens, as Richard stepped out of the house for his morning walk among the trees. Lost in his thoughts, as usual, he noticed Jack tending to the flowers near the old pergola. The young man was kneeling, focused on trimming the branches of a vine sprawling across the wooden arch. The crunch of gravel under Richard's shoes made Jack look up. "Good morning, Mr. Clark," Jack greeted, offering a modest smile. Richard responded politely, but his eyes were immediately drawn to something glinting beneath Jack's shirt. The pendant. He recognized it instantly. There was no mistaking the small silver medallion with a star-shaped outline, hanging from a simple chain. For a moment, Richard felt his body freeze. It was as though the blood had drained from his veins, and the air had grown too heavy to breathe. "Where did you get that?" Richard's voice came out louder than he intended, filled with an urgency he couldn't control. Jack, confused, instinctively touched the pendant. "Oh, this? It was my adoptive mother's, Martha. She gave it to me when I was a kid. She said it would always protect me." Jack's simple explanation only deepened the chaos in Richard's mind. How could this pendant, the very one Ethan had been wearing the day he disappeared, now be in the hands of this young man? Richard crouched down, moving closer to Jack as though he needed to examine the object more carefully, almost fearing his eyes were playing tricks on him. Can I see it?" he managed to say, his voice trembling. Jack, still perplexed, removed the pendant and handed it to Richard. As Richard held the medallion, a surge of conflicting emotions washed over him. It was real. The wear marks, the small scratch on the side that Ethan had made while playing once, it was all exactly as he remembered. Jack watched silently, unsure of what was happening, as Richard stood frozen, staring at the pendant. This belonged to my son," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Jack. The revelation left Jack stunned. "Your son?" he echoed, trying to process the words. But there was no logical connection that could explain how something so personal had come into his possession. Holding the pendant between his fingers, Richard seemed to be transported to another time. Memories of Ethan surged through his mind like an uncontrollable flood. He vividly recalled the day he gave the medallion to his son. It had been Ethan's 8th birthday, and the pendant was a special gift, a symbol of protection and love. "As long as you wear this, we'll always be connected, no matter where you are," he had told the boy, And now, after all these years, that very symbol had reappeared in the most inexplicable way. Jack, on the other hand, was bewildered. He observed the man before him with a mix of curiosity and discomfort, unsure how to react to Richard's visible emotion. "I don't understand," Jack finally said, breaking the seemingly endless silence. "Martha always said she found this pendant with me. I don't remember much from before that, only that I lived with her since I was a kid." Jack's words hit Richard like a thunderclap. His mind began racing to connect the dots, though he knew he had to remain calm. Taking a deep breath, he tried to collect his thoughts. "Martha?" he asked, his voice still laden with emotion. "She's your mother?" Jack shook his head. "Not biologically. She always said she found me in a hospital when I was about 8 years old. But she never explained the details." Richard felt a spark of hope begin to grow. Jack's age, the pendant, and the story of his adoption. All of it seemed to align in an almost eerie way. He knew he couldn't just let it go. "Jack, would you mind if I looked into this further?" he asked, his voice more composed but still heavy with intensity. "I need to know how this pendant ended up with you." Jack hesitated for a moment. Though he had lived a simple life and never given much thought to his past, something about Richard's determination touched him. "I guess I don't see why not," he replied, offering a nervous half-smile. "If it means something to you, then I think it's worth finding out." Richard nodded, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions inside him. He knew this was just the beginning of a journey that might bring answers, or perhaps even more questions. But above all, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a glimmer of genuine hope. After his encounter with Jack, Richard found himself unable to focus on anything else. He returned to his house and locked himself in his study, clutching the pendant as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The possibility that Jack might be Ethan consumed him. Every detail of their conversation replayed in his mind. The story of the hospital, Ethan's disappearance at the same age Jack said he was found, and, of course, the pendant. Everything pointed to something he couldn't ignore. Richard picked up his phone and made a call he had avoided for years. He reached out to David Monroe, the private investigator who had led the search for Ethan in the past. David, now retired, answered with a voice that was deep but still professional. "Richard Clark," David began, surprised to hear from his former client. "I wasn't expecting your call after all this time. What can I do for you?" Richard's response was direct and filled with emotion. "David, I need your help again. There's a new lead on Ethan." David agreed to meet him the next morning, and Richard spent a sleepless night revisiting the events of that fateful day 15 years ago. The park, the distracted nanny, the chaos that followed, the guilt that had consumed him, even though he knew he had done everything in his power. Now, the possibility of finally having answers left him torn between hope and fear. The next morning, David arrived promptly. He still carried the same firm demeanor and sharp gaze he had years ago. After hearing Richard's account, he remained silent for a long moment. "It seems unlikely," the detective finally said, "but not impossible. If Jack was found at a hospital, there should be records. I can start there." Richard agreed, shaking his hand firmly. "Do whatever it takes, David. I want all the answers." As the detective began his investigation, Richard decided to observe Jack more closely. He stepped out into the garden, where Jack continued working with the same dedication as always. The more Richard watched the young man, the more familiar he seemed. The way Jack tilted his head when he was thinking, the casual manner in which he wiped his hands on his pants. These were small gestures that reminded him of Ethan. But was this real, or merely the desperate imaginings of a father grasping at hope? Detective David Monroe began his investigation immediately, leveraging contacts and resources he still maintained from his active years. His first stop was the hospital in San Francisco where, according to Jack, he had been found as a child. David knew that tracking down records from 15 years ago wouldn't be easy, but he was determined. He spent hours combing through digital and physical files until he finally located an entry that matched Jack's information. The record showed that an unidentified boy had been admitted to the hospital with minor injuries, accompanied by a woman who identified herself as Martha Dawson. The medical report indicated that the boy spoke very little about himself and appeared to be in a state of shock. The most intriguing detail, however, was a note in the file. The child was found wandering near the Golden Gate Bridge, visibly disoriented. David followed the lead to Martha Dawson, who now lived in a small town in rural Oregon. He found her in a modest house surrounded by tall trees and flower beds. Martha, now an elderly woman, greeted David with a mix of curiosity and caution. "I'm here to talk about Jack," David said directly, showing his detective badge. Martha looked visibly uncomfortable but agreed to speak. During their conversation, Martha revealed that she had found Jack while on a trip to San Francisco, near the Golden Gate Bridge. "He seemed so lost," she said, her voice trembling. "He didn't know his own name or where he came from. I decided to take him to the hospital and care for him as if he were my own." When asked about the pendant, Martha grew thoughtful. "He already had that when I found him. I thought it was the only thing left from his previous life, so I never took it from him." Meanwhile, Richard, desperate for answers, called David daily to ask for updates. "Is there anything, David?" he would ask, his voice heavy with anticipation and nerves. When David finally shared what he had discovered, Richard felt a mix of relief and frustration. The pieces were starting to come together, but the full truth remained elusive. David suggested that Richard speak with Martha directly. "She seems sincere, but something tells me there's more to this story than she's willing to admit right now. You might be able to get more out of her than I did." Richard agreed, knowing that this meeting would be crucial in getting closer to the answers he sought. Richard arrived in the small Oregon town on a sunny afternoon. The journey had been long, and his anxiety made every mile feel more excruciating. When he finally parked in front of Martha's house, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as he looked at the modest home surrounded by trees. The sound of the wind rustling through the branches seemed to fill the silence as Richard tried to gather the courage for what was about to unfold. Martha opened the door almost immediately after he knocked, as if she had been expecting him. She was a modest-looking woman, with gray hair tied in a loose bun and eyes that reflected a mix of kindness and weariness. "You must be Richard Clark," she said in a soft but firm voice. Richard nodded, thanking her for the welcome as he stepped into the small living room. The space was cozy, with old furniture, a faded floral rug, and a lingering aroma of tea and wood. After a few minutes of polite conversation, Richard got straight to the point. "Martha, I need to know everything you can tell me about Jack. Where you found him, what he was like. Any detail." Martha let out a deep sigh, settling into the armchair by the window. "As I told the detective, I found Jack when he was just a boy, near the Golden Gate Bridge. He was alone, barefoot, and had this vacant look in his eyes that broke my heart. I asked him his name, but he couldn't answer. All he had was that pendant." Richard sensed there was more to her story than she was letting on. "Martha, I know you did everything you could to take care of him, but there's something more you're not telling me, isn't there?" She averted her gaze, hesitating. Finally, after a long silence, she confessed. "There was one thing. The night I brought him home, he had a terrible nightmare. He woke up screaming the name Ethan and saying something about a man and an accident. But over time, he stopped mentioning it, and I thought it best not to push him." Richard's heart nearly stopped at the mention of his son's name. Couldn't be a coincidence. Emotions overwhelmed him, but he knew he had to stay focused. "Do you remember anything else?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. Martha shook her head. "That's all. He was just a lost boy. All I did was give him a home and the love he needed." Richard thanked Martha sincerely for her honesty. As he left her house, he felt closer to the truth than ever before, but also more confused. Who was the man Jack mentioned in his nightmare? And what kind of accident could have changed their lives forever? Returning to Los Angeles, Richard was in a near unbearable state of anxiety. Martha's words echoed in his mind like a chaotic symphony. Ethan, a man, an accident. He knew he couldn't leave these fragments of memory unanswered. The moment he arrived home, he sought out Jack, determined to confront him about what Martha had said, even though it might dredge up painful memories for the young man. Jack was in the garden, as usual, trimming the branches of a hedge. When he saw Richard approaching, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Mr. Clark, is everything okay?" he asked, with a faint look of concern as he noticed the tension on his employer's face. Richard tried to temper his approach, but the intensity of his emotions was hard to contain. "Jack, I need to talk to you. It's about what I discovered on my trip." Intrigued, Jack nodded and followed Richard into the office, where they sat across from each other. Richard began by explaining his visit to Martha and carefully revealed what she had mentioned about the nightmare. Jack's reaction was immediate. He furrowed his brow, leaning forward as if trying to recall something. I think I've had dreams like that before, but I never thought much of them. I always assumed they were just random things." Richard persisted. "Jack, this could be important. Focus. Think about how you felt in those dreams. Is there anything else you can remember?" Jack closed his eyes, his breathing slowing as he delved into his memories. After a few moments, he began speaking hesitantly. "There was a beach. I remember being on the sand, but I wasn't alone. There was someone with me, a man. He was angry, really angry. Then, there was a bright light and loud noises. I think they were cars." Richard's heart raced. Jack's description was vague, but it conjured images that felt strangely specific. "Can you remember the man's face? Or anything he said?" Jack shook his head in frustration. "I can't. It's like everything is blurry. But there's one thing. I always wake up feeling like I was trying to get back to somewhere, or someone." Jack's confession only strengthened Richard's belief that the young man might truly be Ethan. He knew he would need more evidence to confirm his suspicions, but for now, he decided to give Jack time to process everything. At the end of their conversation, Richard placed a firm hand on Jack's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Jack. Together." With the conversation still echoing in his mind, Richard knew the next step would be critical. He contacted David, explaining what he had learned about Jack's nightmares and vague descriptions. The detective listened intently, jotting down notes. "This could be a key piece, Richard. If there was an accident, there might be records, police reports, or even old news articles that could explain what happened back then." David began digging into incidents related to the Golden Gate Bridge and nearby areas around the time of Ethan's disappearance. After hours of exhaustive research, he found something that caught his attention. A police report dated 15 years ago. The report mentioned an abandoned car on the roadside leading to the bridge, with signs of a minor collision. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man with a child near the site, but the pair vanished before authorities arrived. The detail that made David's pulse quicken was the partial description of the man. Tall, with disheveled brown hair and a scar above his left eyebrow. It wasn't enough to identify someone, but it matched other accounts of a suspect linked to child disappearances in the area. Even more compelling, the report mentioned that the child appeared to be wearing a shiny medallion, a piece witnesses said gleamed in the sunlight. David shared his findings with Richard, who listened silently, processing the flood of information. The mention of the pendant convinced him further that Jack might indeed be Ethan. But who was the man with him? And why couldn't Jack or Ethan remember more about the event? "I think we need to go back to the bridge," David suggested. "There's something about that location. It feels like the starting point of everything." The next day, Richard and David traveled to the Golden Gate Bridge. It was a foggy morning, with a mist enveloping the colossal structure, giving it an almost ghostly air. Richard felt a heaviness in his chest as he walked along the shoreline, trying to imagine what might have happened there so many years ago. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks seemed to amplify the melancholy of the moment. David, on the other hand, was meticulously inspecting the surroundings for anything that might have been left behind, some detail forgotten by time. Though they didn't expect to find concrete answers, for Richard, being in that place was meaningful. It felt like a physical connection to the past, a location where he could almost sense Ethan's presence, even without knowing what had truly occurred. As Richard and David walked along the edge near the bridge, immersed in the weight of the place and the memories it evoked, David noticed something unusual. In an area partially obscured by vegetation, there were faint tire marks, faded with time but still visible on the hardened soil. These tracks aren't recent, David observed, crouching down to examine them closely. They could be from the car mentioned in the report. Richard stepped closer, a shiver running down his spine. The idea of being so near to a possible trace of Ethan's past was almost overwhelming. David photographed the tire marks and recorded the coordinates to compare them with the police report later. But the real shock came when Richard noticed something glinting, partially buried in the dirt beside the tracks. He knelt quickly, carefully pulling the object free. It was a metal button, rusted but bearing a design that seemed familiar. David took the button from Richard's hands, examining it under the diffused light filtering through the fog. "This could be something, or it could be nothing," he said cautiously, unwilling to jump to conclusions but not dismissing the find either. "I'll take it for analysis. Maybe we can figure out where it came from or who it belonged to." Richard nodded, understanding that every clue, no matter how small, was a step closer to the truth. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Jack continued his routine in the garden, unaware of the investigation underway. But something inside him felt different since his last conversation with Richard. He couldn't shake the hazy memories that had surfaced. That night, alone in his small room at the back of the property, he began to dream again. This time, however, the dreams were more vivid. He saw the beach, the man, and now a new detail: a black car with headlights shining intensely. The next morning, Jack sought out Richard. "Mr. Clark, I think I remembered something," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Richard immediately stopped what he was doing, giving the young man his full attention. Jack took a deep breath before continuing. "I remember a car, a black car. There was sand and the sound of waves, but I also remember the fear. Something was wrong, very wrong." Jack's words were like a catalyst for Richard, who realized that the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. He told Jack about the trip to the bridge and what they had found, including the button, and suggested that it might be time for Jack to revisit the site to see if it could help him recover more memories. Jack hesitated, clearly shaken by the idea, but Richard placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Jack. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." After a long moment of reflection, Jack nodded, determined to uncover the truth about who he really was. Richard, Jack, and David planned a return trip to the Golden Gate Bridge for the end of the week. The goal was clear: to confront Jack's past head-on, hoping the site could trigger clearer memories and provide new clues. The journey was made in near-total silence. Richard felt the weight of responsibility and the growing hope solidifying in his heart, while Jack seemed lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery outside the window. When they arrived at the bridge, the day was sunny, but a strong wind carried a chilling breeze from the ocean. Jack hesitated as he stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the area as if he recognized something but couldn't pinpoint what it was. Richard watched him closely, ready to offer support. David, ever practical, began revisiting the points of interest they had identified during the previous visit. "Jack, there's no need to rush," Richard said, placing a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder. Jack took a deep breath and walked slowly toward the edge where the tire marks had been found. He crouched down, running his fingers over the dirt as if trying to sense something beyond the physical. "The sand," he murmured. "There was sand everywhere, but I didn't know where I was. And there was a man." He was yelling, and then a loud noise like a crash. Richard exchanged a significant glance with David. It was clear that Jack's memories were beginning to align with the clues they had uncovered. "Do you remember his face?" David asked calmly. Jack shook his head, frustrated. "No, it's like trying to hold water in my hands. The more I try, the more it slips away." After spending several hours exploring the area, David suggested they visit the nearest police station to check for additional records related to the incident report. While Richard and David spoke with the officer in charge, Jack wandered along the shoreline outside. He stopped abruptly when something caught his attention, a worn piece of wood wedged between the rocks, which seemed to be part of a larger object. As he picked it up, flashes flooded his mind. An open suitcase, clothes scattered, and the same piece of wood, intact, being carried by the disheveled-haired man. "Richard!" Jack shouted, clutching the object tightly as he ran back to where the others were. Seeing the expression on Jack's face, Richard knew immediately that something significant had happened. Jack explained what he had remembered, his voice trembling with a mix of emotion and confusion. This was part of something he had. "I'm sure of it." David examined the piece of wood carefully, jotting down details for later analysis. "This might be another piece of the puzzle," he said, maintaining a calm demeanor, though it was clear he too felt the weight of the moment. Richard, however, embraced Jack firmly, as if trying to convey all the strength he had. "We're getting there, Jack. We're closer than ever." The days following their return from the bridge were filled with tension. While David analyzed the piece of wood Jack had found and cross-referenced records of abandoned vehicles, Richard and Jack stayed in Los Angeles, trying to maintain a routine as they awaited answers. Jack, however, seemed increasingly restless. Fragmented memories continued to surface, disrupting his thoughts. He spent hours in the garden, working mechanically while his mind wandered through the unknown. Richard noticed Jack's behavior and decided it was time for a more open conversation. He invited the young man to dinner in the main dining hall, something rare, as Richard typically preferred to eat alone. The table was elegantly set, but the atmosphere was warm and inviting. Jack appeared uneasy at first, unaccustomed to such formality, but he relaxed as he realized Richard just wanted to talk. "Jack, I know all of this has been a lot for you," Richard began, pouring a small amount of wine into his glass. "But I want you to know I'm here to help you, no matter what happens." Jack stared at the plate in front of him, absently moving the food around with his fork. "I know, Mr. Clark. It's just hard. Sometimes I feel like I want to remember, but at the same time, I'm scared of what I'll find." Richard nodded, understanding the young man's dilemma. "Fear is natural, Jack, but the truth, no matter how difficult, is the only thing that sets us free." Silence hung between them for a moment before Jack finally looked up. "You think I'm Ethan, don't you?" The question caught Richard off guard, but he responded with honesty. "I don't know for sure, Jack, but everything points in that direction. And if it's true, it means you have a family that loves you and never stopped looking for you." The conversation brought Jack a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He said little else, but that evening marked a deeper connection between him and Richard. As they cleared the table together, Jack found himself staring at one of the photos of Ethan displayed in the living room. It was like looking at a reflection of himself from another life, and it strengthened his resolve to confront his past, no matter what he uncovered. The next day, David finally brought news. The piece of wood was part of an old suitcase made by a brand that had ceased production in the early 2000s. Additionally, police records identified a vehicle reported stolen and abandoned near the bridge around the same time. The car belonged to a man named Carl Bennett, a name Richard didn't recognize, but David promised to investigate further. The days that followed were intense, with David delving into the mystery of Carl Bennett. He uncovered that Bennett, now in his early 50s, had a murky history of minor crimes and some more serious accusations, including suspicions of kidnapping, though none of these charges had ever resulted in a conviction. Bennett had disappeared years ago, but recent records suggested he might be living in a small town in Northern California, working temporary jobs and keeping a low profile. Richard felt both anxious and cautious about the new developments. He knew confronting Carl could be dangerous, especially if the man had been involved in Ethan's disappearance. Still, he didn't hesitate to support the idea of David traveling to the town to investigate in person. When Jack heard Carl's name, he didn't show immediate recognition, but something in his expression shifted. It was as though the name had sparked a glimmer of something buried deep in his mind. "I don't know why, but that name, it feels familiar somehow," he said, struggling to piece together his thoughts. While David traveled, Richard and Jack continued exploring the young man's memories. One quiet afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Jack began speaking more about the flashes of memory he'd been having. "I think he was trying to run away from something. I don't know what exactly, but there was so much fear, and anger too." Richard listened intently, feeling the weight of every word. He understood that these memories were fragments of a story that, once complete, could change everything. David returned 2 days later with crucial information. He had found Carl Bennett living in an isolated cabin near a lake, about 60 miles from the nearest town. "He's reclusive, but locals say he gets nervous whenever the police are around," David reported. "I talked to a few people and casually mentioned Ethan. It wasn't much, but I saw him react to the name. He tried to hide it, but his eyes gave him away." Richard decided it was time to act. He knew he had to confront Carl directly, but he also wanted to protect Jack. "You don't have to be there for this, Jack," he said, trying to shield the young man from further pain. But Jack was resolute. "If there's a chance to find out the truth about who I am, I need to be there. I have to." The next day, the three of them set off together for Carl's cabin. The tension in the car was palpable, each of them lost in their thoughts about what might happen. When they finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as David had described. Simple, almost dilapidated, surrounded by dense forest and an oppressive silence. Richard glanced at Jack, searching for confirmation that he was ready. The young man nodded, his eyes filled with determination despite the fear that lingered beneath the surface. Carl Bennett's cabin looked like something out of a nightmare. The wooden walls were covered in moss, and the partially shattered windows revealed a dark, dusty interior. The place exuded an air of abandonment, yet it was clear someone still lived there. Richard, Jack, and David approached cautiously, each step crunching dry leaves beneath their feet, the sound echoing through the silent woods. David was the first to knock on the door, his expression serious and his posture firm. After a few seconds, heavy footsteps sounded from within, followed by the creak of the door opening. Carl Bennett appeared in the doorway, a robust man with disheveled hair and eyes filled with suspicion. "Who are you? What do you want?" he demanded, his voice rough and laced with irritation. Richard stepped forward, striving to keep his composure. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Richard Clark. We're here to talk about something that happened many years ago, something involving my son." At these words, Carl froze for a moment. His gaze shifted to Jack, who stood just behind Richard, and something in his expression changed. It was subtle but noticeable, a mix of recognition and unease. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Leave," Carl said, starting to close the door. But David was quick, placing his hand firmly on the door before it could shut. "We're here for answers, Carl," the detective said firmly. "We know you were involved in what happened near the Golden Gate Bridge 15 years ago." Carl looked as though he was about to protest, but then Jack stepped forward, his voice trembling yet resolute. "I remember you. Not everything, but I remember. You were there. You took me." The impact of Jack's words hit like a punch in the air. Carl stared at him with a mix of shock and something that looked like regret but said nothing. The tension in the air was thick, broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Finally, Carl sighed, leaning against the doorframe as though the weight of the moment had drained him. "I didn't want to do it," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the ground. "It was a mistake. The whole thing was a mistake." Carl invited the three inside, and the interior of the cabin was even more dilapidated than it had appeared from the outside. He pulled out a chair and sank into it heavily, while Richard and the others remained standing. "I was hired," he began, his voice low and laden with guilt. "I don't know by who. I never knew. They just told me to take the boy and keep him far away. But when things started going wrong, I couldn't go through with it. I left him near the bridge and walked away." Jack stood motionless, absorbing every word as though trying to piece them into his fragmented memories. "Why was I taken?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Carl shook his head. "I don't know. They never told me. I just did what I was told. And I've regretted it every day since." Richard felt a wave of both anger and relief. Anger at knowing someone had hurt his son so cruelly, yet relief that they were finally uncovering the truth. "Who hired you?" Richard pressed, but Carl only shook his head again. "I don't know. It was all so organized. But I never knew who was behind it." After the confrontation in Carl Bennett's cabin, Richard, Jack, and David returned to Los Angeles with more questions than answers. But something had shifted. For the first time, Jack felt he was beginning to understand his own story, even though the details remained painful and fragmented. Richard, meanwhile, was more determined than ever to close this chapter and bring justice to the son he now believed he had found. Carl agreed to cooperate, providing limited but crucial information that led David to uncover a larger network of individuals involved in similar disappearance cases. The investigation revealed that Ethan had been the target of an extortion attempt that never reached its conclusion because Carl, unable to carry out the plan, abandoned him. This network, once powerful, was now fragmented and weakened, allowing the truth to emerge without fear of retaliation. As the legal investigations continued, Richard and Jack focused on something more vital: rebuilding the bond that had been lost. Richard suggested a trip to a special place, a beach house he and Ethan used to visit. When they arrived, Jack looked around, and something within him seemed to click. The sound of the waves, the scent of the sea, the warmth of the sand beneath his feet, it all evoked long-forgotten memories. He could almost hear the sound of his own childish laughter echoing in the distance. That evening, as the sun set, Richard brought something to Jack: a wooden box containing Ethan's old belongings. Inside were drawings, small toys, and on top, the pendant Richard had kept all those years. Jack held the medallion for a long time before putting it around his neck, next to the one he had worn since his childhood. The gesture was simple but profoundly meaningful. "I think I finally understand who I am," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. Richard sat beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're my son. You always have been." The words, spoken with such love and conviction, broke through the last of Jack's emotional walls. For the first time, he embraced Richard without hesitation, letting the tears flow freely. They weren't just tears of sadness but of acceptance and relief. For the first time, he felt like he truly belonged. In the months that followed, Jack, now fully embracing his identity as Ethan Clark, began reconnecting with his former life. He rediscovered the house, childhood friends, and, most importantly, the love of his father. Though the scars of his journey remained, they no longer defined him. Instead, they became markers of a story he had survived and overcome. In the end, Richard and Ethan, reunited, found a new purpose: helping other families navigate similar losses. They created a foundation in memory of those who had gone missing but were not forgotten. In doing so, they transformed their pain into a force of hope, bringing solace to countless others. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and a comment. Let me know which city you're watching this video from. A big hug, and see you in the next story.